Radio Mises, episode 63, once again in English. And the reason for English is, of course, we have an English guest. As always, your two hosts, Hans and Klaus. And with us, we have Yuri Maltsev, who's a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises-institutet in Auburn, Alabama. He is also an economics professor at Carthage College in the United States. He is a former defector from the Soviet Union after being economic advisor to Gorbachev. And interestingly enough, he defected through Sweden and later ended up in the United States. Hello, Yuri.
Hello.
Hello, Yuri. It's fun to have you with us.
Oh, nice to be with you.
Yeah, we were just talking about that nice Che Guevara poster you have in your office. Should we start there? Start off lightly. You have a Che Guevara poster in your office?
Yes, I have a Che Guevara poster, but its poster is it's actually the face of Che Guevara is made of skulls and pictures of people that he personally murdered. Che Guevara, according to what I was told in Cuba, he personally murdered 2,700 people. So he liked to do that.
Wow. Anyone listening to this podcast who is now from the left, their brains just exploded.
Do you get a lot of students with Che Guevara problems?
Well, because everyone who comes to my office can see it. And I had a liberal colleague, and she looked at that, and at first she was pleasantly surprised. She thought that I converted myself to communism at last. And but then when she looked more attentively and she saw that it's made of skulls, she said, "Why would you put it out?" And I said, "Well, why not?" And her point is that we shouldn't expose students to this kind of right-wing propaganda. So that's...
Yeah, we have a lot of Che Guevara youth in Sweden, unfortunately. We try to tell them that Che Guevara was a very unpleasant man. Sometimes they don't believe us.
That's right. But look, I mean, a lot of Catholics believe in Pope, and Pope believes in Che Guevara. I mean, that's kind of pretty upsetting to all of us.
He does? I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. He was invited. You know, the Pope, he is for sustainable development, for this global warming propaganda and other forms of socialism. But the only good thing, what happened because of his visit, was that Speaker of the House of the United States Congress, John Boehner, just resigned. Because John Boehner, it looks like, had a completely idiotic dream of inviting the Pope for the last 20 years. And he was thinking that he should stick to his position as a Speaker of the House to have this opportunity to invite a socialist Pope to the United States. And now the Pope is gone already, and so Mr. Boehner is resigning, which is making my day. That's the great thing that Mr. Pope did.
So that just backfired on the John Boehner then.
That's right, yes. At first I couldn't believe that he is so much of a useful idiot to Marxists that he invited this Pope, because the Pope is just unbelievable what this Pope is. I think he's a true atheist.
Do you think so? You think there's a connection between his resignation and the visit of the Pope?
Yes, because he said so himself. He was an altar boy when he was a kid, and he was a kind of a Catholic fanatic all his life, or pretended to be. And then, and for 20 last years, when he was one of the leaders of the Republican Party, he was all the time trying to bring the Pope to the United States. That was his dream. And then he brought the Pope, so his dream is already kind of fulfilled, and so he doesn't have anything else to do, as he pointed out, to be a Speaker of the House. Yeah, so this is a kind of like a circus of the Republican Party in the United States.
Yeah.
Funny story. Maybe we should start at the beginning, since we have so much we want to ask you.
You have a special place in your heart for Sweden, we understand.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, that was my gateway to freedom.
Could you tell us how that happened? Or maybe you could start with, you were born in the Soviet Union.
Yes, I was born and raised in the cruel Soviet Union, and I graduated from Moscow State University. And the best thing what happened to me in Moscow State University, I was infected with with the Austrian School of Economics. When I was a fourth-year student, somebody gave me a book by Hayek, Road to Serfdom. And I was given this book only for one night because this book was on a hit list of the KGB. And if KGB would know that I'm reading this book, I would get 6 years of jail or 7. And the guy who gave me the book would get 12 for dissemination of anti-Soviet slander. That was Article 57 of Penal Code of the USSR. And so I've read it, and it was kind of like development of the film, in the sense that a lot of ideas I already had, but Hayek put them so logically, so crystal clear that I really kind of became a convert overnight. And I changed my major from history to history of economic thought, and that's why I was then permitted to read whatever I like to read in economics.
So just for many people in Sweden don't know that much about the Soviet Union, there was actually a list of forbidden books, and you could get 6 years in jail for reading one of them.
That's right, yes. The book, this list, the KGB favorites list, would start with Solzhenitsyn, Hayek, George Orwell, Ludwig von Mises, some Russian writers of the past, who, for example, Nabokov or Ivan Bunin, who got Nobel Prize in literature, they would be also prohibited. They also would be on this list. These books, however, if you are a trusted communist, you need these books, then you can go to the Lenin's library, and they had a special room called the Room for Special Keeping, and the trusted comrades could go into this room and read the book, whatever they like to do to the book or a magazine there in this, but they should sign a pledge that they will never tell anybody anything about it. So it was stupid and funny.
So I read the Gulag Archipelago recently, and there was an Article 58 for counter-revolutionary activities.
That's right.
And 50, that was very popular. You could get 10 years, 20 years, or for almost anything. But this was Article 57, you said, for...
I think so, yeah. Maybe I forgot, yeah, but not sure which number is that. 57 or 50. 57 also is anti-Soviet slander, yeah. 58 is anti-Soviet activity already.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That means that after you read something, you're like, I don't know, take a axe or a brick or something, and then it's already Article 58.
Right. So what did you do with this new knowledge for the rest of your career? I mean, how did you...
Well, I was kind of trying to lay low in the sense that I really was thinking that the best would be how to find freedom in that unfree world. And so I was very interested in economics, other social sciences, was reading quite a lot because I've got this access because I was a student in Moscow State University. And officially, they thought that I am reading all this Western economics to criticize them. Because if you will look at Karl Marx, everything which was before Karl Marx was considered to be good. Because, for example, Adam Smith or David Ricardo were considered to be very good. For what reason? Because Karl Marx read them, and that's how he developed Karl Marx out of himself, Marxist ideology, Marxism. However, the people after Karl Marx, economists after Karl Marx, if they're not Marxists, they are considered to be vulgar, bourgeois political economists. They would be considered kind of lackeys or servants of capitalism, of bourgeoisie, because Marx already came up with the wisdom and with the truth. But they're saying, no, he's not true. So that means that they are just being bought, that they're just clowns or puppets of capitalists.
did people generally, I mean, considering books, did people know there were a lot of books out there, other literature than the allowed literature?
Yes, in the Soviet Union, there was an underground industry which was called samizdat. Samizdat, that were, to translate in English, would be self-publishing. Self-publishing. Many people would be involved into that. And for example, a book by Hayek was a very blind copy, just typed through the carbon paper in Russian, and translation was not very good. So people without any remuneration, I mean, the only remuneration you can get is like to have 12 years in jail, but they would translate and publish it in their free time and try to disseminate it to as many people as possible.
So people did this despite knowing they could get up to 12 years in jail for just translating a book.
Of course, yes. Because they would be sometimes, I mean, under Stalin, they would be just shot. There will be absolutely no leniency towards them. But already under Brezhnev, I think that things became the KGB was not shooting so much. And that's actually was the reason that Soviet Union collapsed. Many people here in the United States do not understand why the evil empire, which was so strong and whatnot, and had 26,000 nuclear warheads and the strongest navy in the world and nuclear submarines and things like that, why did they collapse overnight? And they collapsed overnight because that regime was only based on violence, on coercion. And when Mr. Gorbachev inadvertently removed this violence out of the regime, then regime collapsed like a cart house. Because there was no glue, no any other reason for this regime to exist without violence. The issue is that socialism does not have any incentives, to do anything. So the government, to make you do what they want you to do, they should apply violence because they cannot offer you anything. The only thing they can offer is immediate death or to be rotten in the dreadful gulag for many, many years. And so the people were very much afraid, and that's why they did what the government was asking them to do or telling them to do. So in other words, socialism is nothing but public slavery. It's public slavery in the sense that the people are owned by its own government. Not the government is owned by people, which is kind of like an illusion here in the West that we own our government. But government over there would own people absolutely. Here the government also is trying to own us and trying to tell us what we should do and what we shouldn't. But still we have a market economy, mostly market economy, and we can still have choices. And because what is freedom? Freedom is nothing but choices. And under socialism, under Soviet regime, there's no choices. They're making choices for you.
To what extent did people support the system? I mean, after decades of public schooling, indoctrination, and propaganda, doesn't it take some effect in people's minds?
Yes, it did, both yes and no. Because when the Soviet Union was in the process of disintegrating, then most people didn't care much about it, and nobody was trying to save it. From another hand, we have something, as you know, called Stockholm Syndrome, in the sense that many people, because they were slaves and were told what to do, they kind of liked it. Because, for example, if Hans is telling me what to do and I'm his slave, then if something that he's telling me is not true or have bad consequences, whom should I blame? Hans. If I would be in charge of my life, the only person I could blame would be myself. And so, for many people, it was easier to blame everything on Soviet government. And they did, and rightly so. But then, when so-called freedom arrived to the Soviet Union, which was never free after Russia, was never free even after the collapse of Soviet Union, then for many people, they just didn't know what to do because they already didn't like the idea of making choices themselves. And that's why we have this type of nostalgia about Soviet Union, or I wouldn't say even about socialism, about totalitarianism in general, that these people, free people, elected ex-KGB officer, Mr. Putin, in the more or less free elections of the year 2000. Can you imagine that KGB murdered anywhere from 43 to 60 million people in the Soviet Union? Way more than Gestapo or SS in Nazi Germany. Can you imagine if former Nazi officer, say Gestapo officer, would be elected even as a dog catcher in a remote village? That would be a national tragedy over there. But it looks like Russian people already had completely forgot their recent history and elected a proud KGB officer. Mr. Putin is proud KGB. He doesn't have any remorse for what was done by his predecessors. So that's very sad, but it's true. Private slavery, as disgusting as it is as well, would never result in such a mass murder as public slavery, because under public slavery, people are considered not to be assets, but liabilities as well. In most cases, liabilities. And so not many people realize that most people who were murdered or who found their death in the dreadful Gulag were older people, people with disabilities, orphans. So that's how the Soviet Union was doing the social cleansing, as they would say.
It's amazing because we have this thing in, well, not only in Sweden, but we try to tell people that the Soviet regime and Mao in China as well was pretty much just as bad as the Nazis, but people don't want to believe that. They want to say, well, they wanted to do something nice. Communism works in theory. People just do it wrong, and we hear this all the time.
Exactly, right. There is a good Russian saying that the only lesson of history is that it does not teach us anything. And that's exactly what it is. Yeah,
it's a very sad saying, but perhaps it's a bit true as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. Yes, and there was just recollected, it was a pretty funny joke at that time, which explains why Soviet Union failed, why Soviet Union collapsed. And the joke was that the CIA didn't know what's happening under Mr. Gorbachev's perestroika, and they sent their best agent, kind of like James Bond of the CIA, to Moscow. And this agent is walking from one store to another, and he walks into a butcher shop, and there is no meat, and he writes in his little notebook, no meat. He goes to bakery, and he writes in his little notebook, no bread. He goes to the shoe store, writing, no shoes. And there is a KGB officer overlooking over his shoulder, and he said, 10 years ago, you would be shot for doing that. And he writes there, no bullets. And so when people realized there are no bullets, then everybody stopped working. And that was the end of everything.
Do you think it could have survived longer with if the violence had been maintained, or was there economic reasons for its failure too?
Absolutely. Well, economic reasons. If you will look at the history of the USSR, then you will see that the highest rates of economic growth were achieved when they were shooting people a lot. In 1930s, that was making of the super empire, of the superpower. That's where Stalin's regime were murdering people with the speed sometimes 10,000 per day. So when it was a real meat grinder, then rates of economic growth were about 10% per year. And so when they stopped shooting people, because again, there is no incentives to do anything. If I worked, my first job was the Ministry of Labor of Soviet Union, and I was in the Labor Research Institute doing this labor research. And And the idea was, at first, that, yes, we can, for example, invent, my first job was to come up with some new forms of remuneration, some new wage systems that we should pay those who work more, we should pay more. That was the greatest idea. But this idea was as phony as all other ideas under socialism, because you couldn't buy anything. This money were worthless. And people would not be interested in working more to get more of these pictures of Lenin. And
that's what you could buy in the Soviet Union, pictures of Lenin.
A picture, and pictures of Lenin, where the money would be as worthy as they were printed on money. Lenin was the only one printed on all money. And so that was the kind of thing. And it kind of tells you also that those people who embraced freedom, who embraced economic reforms, true economic reforms, they did very well, because if you will look across Baltic Sea, you will see a very good example of Estonia, of Latvia, of Lithuania, who made it out of Soviet slavery and ended up in, I would say, relatively better situation than most other parts of the former USSR.
So we hope that the Swedish neoliberals don't listen to this, because then they will get ideas of how to increase GDP and economic growth.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Here we have government which is so anti-capitalist. I can't believe it. So some people would say, well, is Mr. Obama a Marxist-Leninist? And my answer is that I don't know whether he is Marxist-Leninist, but he acts exactly like one. Because his government is, and it looks like this capitalism or free markets, they still can endure a lot. Because even with all this anti-capitalist mentality in Washington, D.C., still there are no shortages of anything.
Yeah, it's amazing how resilient markets are, despite all they do.
Yes, of course.
Could you just, I think I want to paint a picture of the Soviet Union for our listeners. Could you tell us something about how was everyday life in the Soviet Union? Was there food, cars, what was there?
Well, cars, they had cars, and these cars were only for party officials. And they were most of these cars were black. And cars would never stop when they see a pedestrian. So if you are a pedestrian in the Soviet Union, you should run away when you see a car, because usually that would be little people would walk, and the big people, I mean the big in the social value, so-called, they would be in the cars. So then cars officially, I think I remember stats, they had, I think, private ownership of cars. They permitted that, I think, in 1960s. And they had, if I'm not mistaken, one car for 217 households in private ownership.
That's not a lot.
It's not a lot. For 217. So in the United States, we have a couple of cars usually per household. And so that's even poor people have a lot of cars in the United States. I think 74% of poor households under the poverty line do have cars. So that's the kind of gives you a perspective on one. Then it was very bleak and grim society. They wouldn't have restaurants or bars. I mean, they had restaurants, but you'll go to this restaurant, they would either poison you or cheat on you or beat you up or whatever. Most people had very bad experiences with these restaurants, and so that's why I, for example, myself avoided it. I remember I was in Leningrad today, St. Petersburg, with a good friend, and there was a guy, I think was an American, and he was a tourist probably, and he asked us, it was maybe pretty late, close to midnight, and he asked, stopped us on the street, and he said, "Where can I get a drink?" And a friend of mine, he said, that way you can get a drink. And he said, where is that? He said that would be in Stockholm. and so that's
it's really horrible to hear about. I mean, we laugh now because we haven't lived through this, but it's almost unimaginable for us how poor the Soviet Union must have been.
Exactly, very, very poor. And the perestroika, which was initiated by Mr. Gorbachev, was to reform. He didn't want to scrap away this wonderful socialist economy, so he wanted to change it or to reform it, to make it nicer. And nobody could know what does it mean, and he didn't have a clue. So he inadvertently removed fear out of the system, which was glued only by fear. And his chief economic advisor was Abel Aganbegyan. Abel Aganbegyan, he still is in Russia and a famous economist there. We called him the biggest economist in the world. He was definitely over 200 kilograms. and once, that's the only funny thing I heard from Mr. Gorbachev, that what Mr. Aganbegyan was telling all of us, that what we need is to build a Swedish model of socialism. And Mr. Gorbachev, he said, Abel, where you would get all the Swedes to do it? and that's exactly, I think, why they couldn't build it, because they didn't have enough Swedes.
Sweden is a bit special in that way. I mean, Sweden is famous for our welfare state. What most people don't know is that the Swedish welfare state was fairly small until the late 1960s, and then it grew and the economy started going really bad and then worse.
Yes. I think that Sweden made a fantastic progress, I think, in the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and definitely will be way more wealthier if you would not have so many people to feed or
no, I mean, in Sweden we had a strong the left has run this country almost since the Second World War. It's a bit different now, but generally there's still a lot of welfare statism. But Sweden always, during the 70s and 80s, there was this admiration for the Soviet and East Germany, and people said, I mean, we had the government-run radio and television here, and we still do DDR jokes about them. I mean, the government-run television is like East Germany in this country.
Yes, well, I mean, East Germany is a very good example because of the failure of socialism, because if something does not work, usually Germans can make it work. And they couldn't with socialism. It was such a misery, this is Germany, except for visitors from the West. They thought that East Germany is a very great kind of window into socialism. And very sadly, in the Soviet Union, when many people would come from United States, the fellow travelers, or from United Kingdom, and they will look into this disaster and would say, oh, isn't it great how nice it is that there is no unemployment here? Yeah, if you put all unemployed people into concentration camps, then you wouldn't have unemployment at all. So that was the case. And I traveled to Cuba, which our president is a great lover of. And Cuba is like this. In Cuba, they don't have unemployment, but they don't have employment either. It's an unbelievable country with the average wage today is about $9 per month. And still, I have a lot of my colleagues who would go to Cuba and they would like everything. And they would like healthcare like there is healthcare. There's no healthcare. There's a very good website called therealcuba.com. In one word, therealcuba.com. There is plenty of pictures of this free healthcare, so-called free healthcare in Cuba. And I have a friend, a Cuban, whom I met back in the Soviet Union a long time ago. And now he is up there in the government. He asked me never to use his name because he is afraid of his own KGB. But I would invite him to talk to my students when we were in Cuba, about Cuba. And he was asked, how about healthcare? One young woman asked him, how about healthcare? We heard that healthcare in Cuba is fantastic. And everything else, she said, looks like in a very big disrepair. He said, healthcare, yeah, we have great healthcare, the best in the world. But it can be improved. As a true communist, I all the time see the room for improvement. And it would be much better if we would have doctors and medicines and hospitals and ambulances and clinics. Then it would be just perfect. And then when we were walking out of this auditorium, in Russian, he said, healthcare, swim to Miami. That's the healthcare I know about. So this is, and he even is up there, and even for big bosses, they have pretty primitive healthcare. But if you will go to a pharmacy in Havana, they have only two types of medicine: pictures of Che Guevara or pictures of Fidel brothers. Oh. So you can administer probably Che Guevara to, I don't know, to what kind of disorders. I think it's, I think watching these videos, watching these pictures can only lead to psychiatric disorders.
So you're saying that Michael Moore's movie doesn't really tell the full picture?
Yes, Michael Moore, he is, as Abel Aganbegyan was the biggest economist, I think that Mike Moore is the biggest liar or the biggest propaganda person in the world.
Yeah, it's interesting that Michael Moore doesn't just move to Cuba. I mean, they have great healthcare according to him, so he should just move, I guess.
That's right, yeah. I would be happy if he would move anywhere.
So what was driving Mr. Gorbachev's perestroika? Why did he see a need to do this? Some accuse him of being a Western agent destroying the Soviet Union.
Right, yes. And he was, I think he was kind of a socialist, but had a strange idea that you can have a socialism without these repressions, without this coercion. And he was, I think, like Mr. Obama, he was trying to emulate Sweden or some other capitalist countries, but with socialist leadership. So I think that he believed that socialism is such a nice thing that people will not throw it out if violence, if repression, if mass murder will be removed. And he was wrong on that. Only countries like Cuba or like North Korea survived as socialist countries because they still are applying mass murder in coercion in big quantities. So that's the only way to survive. So Mr. Gorbachev's perestroika ended up in a disaster. Well, the good thing definitely was that the Soviet Union collapsed and 15 countries, different countries, emerged in the rubble of the USSR, and they are trying to get from slavery to freedom or prosperity in different ways. And some of them are failing, like Russia or Ukraine or Moldova. Some of them are doing very well, as Baltic states, for example. And it tells us that microeconomics works, that what great economists like Milton, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman, Hayek, that they were telling us about freedom and capitalism, that it's absolutely true.
Could you tell us the story about, you defected. What year did you leave the Soviet Union?
I went to Finland in 1989. On a lecturing tour. And I was lecturing left and right everywhere in Finland. And I was not planning to defect because in 1989, Finland was almost under control of Kremlin. There was a policy of so-called Finlandization. And at that time, if I would try to defect from Finland, I would be forcefully returned by Finns to the USSR, and I would get 12 years of hard labor in Eastern Siberia. And I was definitely not looking for that kind of career change at all, because because the funny thing, they would say that you shouldn't be afraid of 12 years, you will die in 3 or 4. So that was not out of my plans, and I was not planning to defect. But I had a speech at the Ministry of Finance of Finland, and after that speech, many people went to a banquet to eat something, but my path to all this finger food was blocked by more people who were asking me more questions. And one of them, he said, you were so critical of communism. Are you afraid of going back to the Soviet Union? And if I would say, no, I'm not, I would probably still be in Moscow. But the same day in the morning, I did an interview for the Swedish TV, actually, for Swedish TV in Finland. And the moderator, she said, you were so critical to Mr. Gorbachev, but we love him in Scandinavia. And I said, well, if you love him, we can sell him for a reasonable amount of sausage or margarine or flour or washing detergent. And she didn't find it funny, but later I got a call from Soviet embassy, and the guy from the embassy, he said, you're in no position to sell anything for anything, and on and on like that. And he said, well, we'll talk about that in Moscow. And so that was the reason that I, instead of saying, no, I'm not afraid of what I'm saying about socialism, I said, do you have other options? And the gentleman, he said, yeah, we can do something. I said, oh, go ahead and do it. He asked me what the hotel I was staying in, and I told him the name. And then when I came back to my hotel was a message, call Walden as soon as possible, ASAP. And so I called this Walden, and he said, let's go to Sweden tomorrow. And I didn't realize what he's talking about. I looked at my appointment book. I said, no way, I'm all booked. And he said, oh, you cannot squeeze defection into your tight schedule. And then I realized what he's talking about. And I said, of course. And I looked, I said, Friday. He was laughing again, saying, Friday is defection day. I said, Friday I'm supposed to go back to Soviet Union, so nobody will be looking for me. He said, does make perfect sense. And so on that Friday, we went to Vaasa and took a ferry boat to Umeå, and I took an overnight train from Umeå to Stockholm, walked into the U.S. Embassy, and asked for political asylum. And Marine Guard, there he said, okay, sir, but it's Saturday, come back on Monday after 9 o'clock. And so I didn't want to do that because I was an illegal immigrant in Sweden. Well, I said illegal immigrant. In the United States, you never can say that again. You should call them undocumented workers.
Yeah.
So I was an undocumented worker, even if I'm not working, in Sweden. And I said, I'm not going anywhere. And so he got an officer on duty, and I spent another month in Sweden, and the embassy put me in a very nice hotel, Burger Jarl, in downtown Stockholm, and I was exploring Stockholm to the point that I visited almost everything. And I think about a month after my life in Stockholm, this guy from the embassy, probably a CIA officer, he called me and he said, what did you do today? And I said, today I visited an exhibition of Lapland folk embroidery. And he said, there's no such thing. I said, yeah, there is. And very interesting. And he said, now you can go to the United States. And I didn't tell you that before I went to Finland, my colleagues, when they found out that I'm going to Finland, they would stop by my office and ask me to bring them something. And I asked my secretary to take notes, what to bring and to whom. And she did. And at the end of the day, she said, interestingly enough, that women, they, as she put it, the nice-looking ones, they like you to bring them a lipstick and mascara. The ugly ones, she said, which you also cannot say in the United States, you should say you should say, optically disadvantaged. But I'm quoting that Soviet person. The ugly ones want floppy disks, because there were no floppy disks in Soviet Union. Floppy disks. And I said, how about men? And men want only one thing, condoms, because there are no condoms in Soviet Union. And everybody was very afraid of AIDS at that time. It was the end of the 1980s, and many people thought that AIDS you can be transmitted even through the telephone call or something. And so, and Soviet government was spreading rumors that AIDS was invented by the CIA to kill the Soviets. And so condoms, and I bought a lot of mascara and lipstick and condoms and everything to bring back to the Soviet Union, because I didn't know that I would be defecting. And to make long story short, I'm arriving to Kennedy Airport in New York, and the customs lady, she looked at my Soviet briefcase, suitcase, which looked very unusual. And she said, "Can you please open that?" I opened that, and there are boxes of lipsticks and condoms and everything. And she took my Soviet diplomatic passport, which has a stamp, admitted as refugee. And she looked at that, and she said, "Well, you are coming for good." I said, "Yes, for good." And then she said, "Is that business samples or that's for private use?" I said, "That's for private use." Even Soviet economists would know that's what you should say. And so it's for private use. Then she again looked at my passport. She said, "But you're coming for good." I said, "Yes." And then she smiled and she said, "I wouldn't let you in for a weekend trip with this," because there were literally boxes of everything. And the funny thing was that I brought all this stuff and put it in the attic in my apartment in Washington, D.C., and then I had a visitor from Soviet Union, another great economist, Soviet economist, and I invited him for a dinner. And he asked me how did I defect, and I told him exactly the same story as I'm telling you. And he said, "So where is the stuff?" And I said, "It's in my attic." And he said, "Oh, I can deliver it to comrades." And so the stuff ended up back in the Soviet Union. So that's how I kind of defected.
It's a great story. It really is. But so you saw Stockholm for a month. Did you like Stockholm?
Oh, yes, very much so. Very much so. I spent most of my time, I was attending, it was I think it's called Skousen Park, Skousen Island. And there is a Prince Eugene's palace there.
Yep, Djurgården.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful palace, and there is a very nice outdoors, kind of like a beach. And I spent a lot of time over there. Then I was visiting all museums in Stockholm, everything possible and impossible. And I also just like to walk, because Stockholm is a beautiful. And over the weekend, usually I would take a train and go to Uppsala and walk around there.
Very nice.
So I really like Sweden a lot.
Could you tell us something about your Soviet career? What was Soviet economics like from the inside?
Yeah, well, Soviet economics, kind of the good thing about Soviet government, if there is any good thing, that nobody in the Soviet Union believed in this Marxist garbage. My greatest disappointment with the United States is that so many of my colleagues, so many people in academia, are true believers. They never tried this Marxism on themselves, and they think it's great and it's so fair, it's so nice. And then we have our own politicians like Obama. If that's not enough, we invite the Pope, who is telling us all this lies and lies and lies again. But in the Soviet Union, you couldn't believe in socialism if you see the country of 11 time zones, the biggest thing in the world, completely destroyed by these idiotic ideas and by its own government. In the point, in 1980s, already shortages were overwhelming. There was nothing, absolutely nothing to buy. My job before I joined the economics reform crowd of Mr. Gorbachev, before that I worked as a chief consultant of the Soviet Bank for Foreign Trade. And my secretary, once I noticed she is taking paper clips, stealing paper clips, putting into her purse. I said, Lena, why in the world you would steal paper clips? And she went ballistic on me. She said, Yuri, what else can I take from this? And she used very bad word, office. Pointed me. I'll take that. There is nothing here on Lenin's picture and paper clips. And she was so upset by that she couldn't steal anything else. That was the kind of the attitude of most Soviets toward their beloved government. Also, funny enough, like maybe 3 or 4 months later, she invited me to her New Year party because Christmas was kind of prohibited. If you are not a very old person, then and you are religious, you wouldn't get a job or you wouldn't enjoy anything. So Christmas was not celebrated. People celebrated New Year only. And so at New Year party, I went there and it was New Year tree, which is just a Christmas tree in disguise. And I couldn't refrain from laughing because I saw where the paper clips went. Because if you put paper clips one upon another, you can make a chain. And so it was a kind of typical Soviet, I would say, gruesome looking New Year tree, all covered with paper clips. It's probably would be good only for the office supply store. That's how
I mean, that's really sad.
It is sad, yeah. It is sad, very sad. And then many people don't realize that when statistics, for example, when I worked for the government as one of economic advisors, I wasn't the advisor. I wouldn't take the blame for what happened. I was an advisor. I was working, my field was reform of the civil service in the Soviet Union. And civil service was uncivil disservice over there. It was called nomenclatura. It was very difficult task, and nobody was really serious about any kinds of reforms. But in Soviet Union, life was, because I had access to all statistics, I still remember some. Like, for example, 36% of all hospitals didn't have water or sewer systems. And that was in a superpower which had 26,000 nuclear warheads, which would launch people into space and do all kind of other technological wonders. But 36, over 1/3 of all hospitals would not have water supply and sewer system. So can you imagine if you had a surgery, in that kind of circumstances, and then you need to go to the outhouse to relieve yourself, or the nurse should go to the well and get some water. That was just. I was elected when Perestroika started. I was unexpectedly for myself elected like a local councilman. Had 29,000 people in my district, and I was inspecting their living conditions. Those who would complain about their living conditions, I was the first person to go and see whether their complaint is justified and they need to be put on a waiting list, which can also take tens of years to get another better housing. And for example, I remember the first person, he and his family of 9 people lived on 12 square meters room, and they shared the bathroom with another 4 families. So it was overall, I think 22 people for a bathroom and a kitchen. So under Tsars, it was just 1 family lived there. Now 4 families, and they lived in 12 square meters. 9 people. One of them was an old babushka, old lady. She was in her 80s, and she could not contain her fluids anymore. So it was an awful stench in the room. And people lived in bunk beds. And this person, he was a 44 years old worker. And he told me that his wife developed some women's illnesses, as he put it, because he would take her to the forest in winter, all year round, to make love there, because if you have 9 people in the room and one is paralyzed, there is no privacy there. So can you imagine what kind of life many Soviets would experience? And he told me, however, and that tells you how brainwashed were people. He told me, however, that what is really nice that he is paying very little, $2, 2 rubles 40 cents for this room. And it was funny for me to see and to hear because bureaucrats they would also pay peanuts for their huge apartments and making people to believe that unlike the West, housing is almost free in the Soviet Union because people lived in free jail cells, I would say.
My mother used to receive visitors from the Soviet Union to come and see our apartments. And we had a three-room apartment and a kitchen. And all of them would ask, how many families live here? And when she said only one family, nobody would believe her.
That's right, yes. That the housing was just the most disgusting thing. And because I was kind of entrepreneurial, and I lived in a small apartment, small room even, in downtown Moscow, I managed to exchange this for 4 rooms apartment in the suburbs, far away from downtown. And I lived like a king over there, just by myself. And I was paying also very little, and 10 rubles for everything, for the apartment, for water supply, for electricity, for everything. Well, as a comparison, a small bottle of vodka would cost 15 rubles, and 10 rubles a monthly rent. So you can see who would benefit. The people who would have big apartments, they would benefit, but they would say apartment is kind of like a human right, and that's why we shouldn't charge much. Price of meat in the Soviet Union, which nobody could find in any store, was very low, only 2 rubles per kilo, just nothing. From another hand, who would find this meat? The bureaucrats, the government officials. So they, in their special stores, they would. And when I began to work on Gorbachev's reforms, I got admitted to this store, and I immediately was promoted to another healthcare system for the few, for the so-called better people. And that was nothing even close to equality in the Soviet Union.
This reminds me of the calculation problem that Mises talks about. Nothing has real prices. How did that affect, say, a budgeting process? Did you see anything like 5-year plans, how they were made up?
Exactly. Well, how were they made up? They were just, all the planning was done on a ratchet principle. Ratchet principle means that they would just add another 5% or 10% to your output of the yesterday's year. And that's why everybody was trying to do as little as they possibly can, because then they would add more and more and more. That's one thing. Another thing, the economy was so irrational. Mr. Gorbachev was at first, I was thinking that he is very irrational. And he doesn't know what he's talking about, because he would, for example, he would say, planning economy works. The problem is that we never had a good plan. So can you imagine? So you would think, yes, and I was sitting next to another famous economist in the Soviet Union, and he said, do you think there is anything behind this birthmark? And I was thinking, yeah, probably nothing. And that was just very strange to hear, that we didn't have a good plan. Then Mr. Gorbachev came with another idiotic idea that we should introduce profit, that capitalism is surviving well because they have profit, and we don't have even category of profit. And so they came with the category of profit, which from Marx's point of view, will be something like surplus value. But profit turned out to be the last nail into the coffin of socialist economy. Because profit, how you can find profit with no competition? There is no competition. By definition, socialism is against competition. Competition would be considered waste. Waste is unnecessary duplication, parallelism, as Lenin would say. So we don't need that. And so how then you can come up with a profit? And they decided to put profit as something like a normative category. For example, if your cost is 1 ruble, then we can add 20% as profit to the cost. So the price of the good, of what they produce, would be 1 ruble 20 kopecks. 1 ruble 20, out of which 1 ruble would cover your costs and 20 kopecks would be your profit. But then even the last dyslexic would find out that if your costs would be 2 rubles, then your profit would be 40 kopecks. And if it would be 3, then on and on and on, 60 kopecks. And to increase costs, it's very easy. It's a very pleasant kind of thing to do. You just don't work much, and your costs will go up. Or you put your lover on the payroll, or you do something else like this, buy yourself a new company car, and on and on like that. And so then the costs were going through the roof, and all the so-called profit turned out to be a complete disaster, and that was the economic end. That's when everybody stopped doing anything at all.
It's remarkable how things go south if you try to cheat economics.
Yes, it's amazing how people, because many people in the Soviet Union who pretended to be economists. I worked with Leonid Abalkin, who was at that time first deputy prime minister of the evil empire. And he would ask me, he would say, Yuri, you know English, what is Phillips curve? I would say, well, Phillips curve is I think it's not true, but it is a relationship between unemployment and inflation. And he said, well, we don't have unemployment, we don't have inflation. They don't know what they're talking about, the capitalists. And his point was that under socialism, then the demand curve looks like supply curve, and supply curve looks like a demand curve. And he would talk about this, which was pretty funny too. They were trying to reinvent it, because the problem was that nobody knew economics, not only Austrian economics, nobody knew any neoclassical economics. So they knew that Marxism is not true, but they didn't know any alternatives.
We have, there are 2 stories I have been asked to ask you. One is about the founder of Moscow. And the other one is about Russian Bologna, I think.
All right.
Okay. I don't know, maybe does it make sense to you?
It makes sense to me, because I think I mentioned it somewhere. Because I am trying to write a book, because to write a book about what did I, because I have a lot of, during my pretty long life, I witnessed a lot of things which I think should be a part of history, but I'm not sure that anyone else witnessed them. So because of that, there are certain stories I think that I should include in that book. And about the founder of Moscow, I can tell you that story. It's the founder of Moscow was Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, and he founded Moscow at 1147. In 1947, Stalin decided to celebrate 800th anniversary of the founding of Moscow with a great pomp. Why with a great pomp? He wanted to resurrect the imperial legacy of Russia, because Stalin decided that before him, communists thought that all Tsar's history is bad and painted it only with black paint. But then they resurrected so-called the great heroes, and they decided to make Yuri Dolgoruki one of these great heroes. And Khrushchev at that time was first secretary of the Communist Party of Moscow. So Khrushchev was in charge of these great celebrations. And they decided to find the remains of Yuri Dolgoruki and reconstruct his face and to build a huge monument near Moscow City Council. Yuri Dolgoruki, it's still there. Yuri Dolgoruki is sitting on a horse and pointing at the Moscow City Council. To do this, they appointed young archaeologist. His name was Khalikov, Dr. Khalikov. He's a Tatar by his nationality, to head this team which should recover the remains of Yuri Dolgoruki. And when I was a first-year student in Moscow State University, I was at something called archaeological practice. Well, it was using me just as a kind of a free labor for archaeological excavations. And Mr. Khalikov was in charge over there, and he told me this story. And he told me that he never told this story to anyone yet, except his family. And the story is that when he tried to excavate this remains of Yuri Dolgoruki, he found 92 skeletons in the same collective grave near Moscow. And it was impossible to find out who is Yuri Dolgoruki. So he called Mr. Khrushchev and he said, you know what, impossible. And Khrushchev said, really impossible? He said, I'll be there. And Khrushchev arrived with a team of KGB officers. And he asked Khalikov, which one is Yuri Dolgoruki? Khalikov said, I am so sorry, Nikita Sergeyevich, but I cannot tell which one is that. Then Khrushchev pointed at the nearest one. He said, this is it. And all these KGB people triumphantly took up this skull, put it in a wonderful box with wool, which they brought themselves, and they were on the way out, and the last one said to Mr. Khalikov, nobody would find your skull if you will tell this story to anyone. And so that was already the time. I mean, it was in this archaeology, the end of 1960s. There were no Khrushchev, no Stalin, no nobody. So that's why Mr. Khalikov already felt that he can tell this story. And then he said, like, some months after that, certain academician Yefremov is calling him, and he said, you know, it's very strange that this skull. And so they met, not to use the telephone. Everybody in Soviet Union was very much afraid of talking over the phone because they thought the phones would be taped and monitored by the KGB. So they met in a park, and he said, it looks like it's a Chinese person, and the skull. It's a Chinese. So they went to the studio, and the gypsum which the skull was made, was still wet. And they were just pressing these cheeks until it didn't look anymore as a Chinese person. And that's exactly who is Yuri Dolgoruki there on this monument, which is still in the middle of Moscow. So that's one of the stories of the USSR. But it was really very bleak, very very unpleasant place to live, and so many people were murdered, and that's why I think there are data today is that between 43 and 61 million people were killed by its own government in the Soviet Union. And again, if they elected Mr. Putin, a proud member of this, my last article I published on one of the websites in Russia has a self-descriptive title, Meat voted for a meat grinder. That's kind of very sad, but you can see this is the case today. And Mr. Putin soon will be here in the United States. We'll have all the bad people visiting. The Pope, Putin, Chinese president, right now here. Yes, that's all the Mr. Obama's buddies.
Yeah. Regarding Russia, I mean, it's a tad better now than during the Soviet Union, or is it?
Of course it's better, yes. I mean, even fascism is better than communism. That's for sure. I mean, life in, say, in Nazi Germany, which was also murdering a lot of people, but the economy was much better than economy. Von Mises was talking, and he wrote in Human Action about two different types of socialism, two different patterns, Russian pattern and German pattern. And by Russian, he meant Soviet, when everything is owned by the state. That's a disaster of immense proportion. The other one is German pattern, and German pattern will be practiced by Nazis when property rights are declared but not secured, in the sense that you can have a title to your property, but still the government will tell you what to do, when to do it, whom to hire, whom to fire, how much to charge, how much to pay, all this minimum wage and everything else like that. So that's a German pattern, and I think that under Mr. Putin, Russia has this German pattern of socialism, because you can see that these oligarchs, most of them are either in jail or do not have any say in anything, in political, social, or in economic spheres.
How was Bologna made in Soviet Union?
All right. Yes, we went to Estonia, and in Estonia, I was doing some consulting for Kikkoman Foods, and we met an accountant from the Soviet factory, which was making sausages and everything else, which was in Estonia, but supplying mostly Leningrad area. And she admitted that a lot of Bologna sausage would contain a lot of toilet paper, because there was no toilet paper in the Soviet Union and nobody knew what it is, but it looks like it was all used as a food product, because Bologna was made out of mostly blood and blood products of animals, and would contain a lot of nitrates, and starch. But to make some kind of structure, they would add toilet paper to this product, and people were eating that product because, again, if the government considers you to be a slave and they're feeding members of the government in the special stores, then in the stores for the masses they would sell all kind of bad stuff, and that's why life expectancy was so low in the Soviet Union. Life expectancy for men was 57, for women was 67. So 10 years longer women lived than men, just because they didn't drink so much and didn't smoke so much as the men would. So it was pretty bleak place. The alcoholism was pandemic because life was, there was nothing else to do. Social institutions were absolutely non-existent. No civil society except government sports clubs, which were mostly kind of the breeding points for the fake achievements in the world sport arena, which was also used as propaganda.
We remember the Russian athletes. They were always very much better than the amateurs from other countries.
Yeah, because they were professionals. And not even professionals. They will be taken from their family at pretty early age into special kind of athletic incubators, and would be fed and whatnot. They would use hormones. They would use whatever else is needed to get the gold for the Soviet Union, to pretend that Soviet Union is the healthiest and nicest place, and that was not the case, because there was the sport for the masses mostly was to filter out who can be picked up as the future champions for the Soviet propaganda.
Did you leave any family behind when you defected?
Yes.
Were they punished?
My sister, she was laid off. She lost her job, but Soviet Union fortunately collapsed very soon, and so they they joined me in the United States a year and a half after I made my transition to capitalism.
Right. So maybe to round up, unless Hans has more questions, I'm with your historic view here, what do you see about the future of Europe? Do you see similar patterns?
Yes, I would say I am kind of a pessimist. Well, in Russia also, in Soviet Union, we had a saying that pessimist is actually a better informed optimist. and I would say that what I see I don't like. I don't like this cultural Marxism taking over the West. I don't like this. This political correctness already became so overwhelming that words are losing their meaning. I think Confucius said that when words would lose their meaning, people would lose their liberty, and that's what I think is happening everywhere. In the United States, we have already over half of people are on the dole. The government is creating more and more clients. Right now, we have 51% of Americans who are dependent on this or that government program. So we have the welfare state in its worst. Then you will have people who would vote for their welfare handouts, and then that would be democracy, which would lead to socialism. Lenin, not in agreement with him on almost anything, except he once said that democracy, if logically developed, would lead us to socialism. And I think that our new socialist masters, like Mr. Obama, like many leaders in Europe, they know that the more welfare recipients they would create, and it's easy to create, then the more probable would be that they would vote them into their offices and they would keep them there. And that's, I'm afraid, what I think Joseph Schumpeter, another Austrian economist, he was not Austrian economist from the point of view of Austrian economics, but he was from Austria. He wrote in his Capitalism and Socialism and Democracy, in his seminal book, I think published in 1950, that he is all for capitalism. He loves capitalism, but he is afraid that the future is for socialism. And he cited the same very argument that at a certain point you can just vote this minority, who would be rich people or working people or whatever, out of business altogether and make them slaves of others. And I'm afraid that's what's happening.
So the welfare state is the biggest danger, you see?
Yes, that's right. Yes, welfare state is. Yes, because it's already became absurd, the welfare state. That thousands and thousands of programs. It's millions and millions of so-called social workers all over the West. They already created a huge constituency of their own. That would be people who would vote for a bigger government no matter what. We have one party which is almost proudly socialist party, Democrats, and we have another party, Republicans, who just, I would say, are not proud, but kind of, but also social democrats, yes. When I came to the United States, I met Sam Francis. Sam Francis was a very good Austrian economist, and he was a journalist as well. And he said, Yuri, we have a two-party system. And I was thinking, what he's telling me, everybody knows that. He said, one party is evil and another is stupid. And I said, who are you? He said, I am stupid, I'm Republican. and it looks exactly like that. Sometimes they change roles. Sometimes they have bipartisanship, which is both evil and stupid. So that's not many. Now we had pretty competitive elections campaign with at first with like 17 Republicans were trying to, but then Mr. Trump, who is not conservative even, he is leading the pack, and he is leading the pack to a disaster again. I don't think that non-socialists would have much of a chance in these coming elections, because Mr. Trump, he is self-demonizing himself, and he can be very easily demonized by the left. The left know how to demonize people.
We have 8 social democratic parties in Sweden, or perhaps 1 communist and 7 social democratic parties.
Yes, well, yeah, at least what's nice, usually socialists are fighting each other much more than they're fighting capitalism.
We can always hope. We can always hope.
We have 8 parties that are both evil and stupid.
That's right. But if you remember Lenin, at first he murdered other socialists.
Yeah.
He went after capitalists later. It was those who were near and dear that he took care of first, right? And so that
it was the Bolsheviks that exterminated the Mensheviks.
That's right. Yes, Bolsheviks exterminate Mensheviks. And Mensheviks, well, I would say if we can apply this, then I would call Republicans Mensheviks, and the Democrats would be Bolsheviks. So as bad as both parties are, but Mensheviks are better than Bolsheviks because they didn't have a chance to kill so many people.
I would like to we usually end up with trying to recommend some book or something. Do you have a book recommendation you would like to do, Yuri? Any book at all, actually.
Can be your own if you want to recommend something.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm thinking just one moment. I have a book on my table, which I would like to recommend, by Tom DiLorenzo, my old friend and colleague from Mises-institutet. That's a great, great book. And the title of the book is Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government. That book is published by Ludwig von Mises-Institute, and it was published in 2012. That's a great, great description of modern government. And as you judge from the title, that Thomas DiLorenzo smashes all myths about benevolent government. So I would strongly recommend this book.
All right. Organized Crime by Thomas DiLorenzo will be the book recommendation for this week.
Perfect.
What do your colleagues say, by the way, your co-workers at the university college?
University college, well, the good thing, I'm working for the private liberal arts college, so we don't have much of things in common, and I got my tenure in 1994, and since then I do not attend any faculty meetings. I don't know what they're talking about there.
Just to explain to our Swedish listeners, tenure is you can basically not get fired, right?
That's right, yes. And but I hear, I mean, it's in everywhere else you can see the academics. Most cases, most academics are very socialist. What do you think of your views and experiences? My views and experiences, well, they think that they don't like me. They actually hate me because they cannot praise socialism in my presence. I have a very dear friend in Washington, D.C., Dr. Walter Williams. And when I first met him, he said, Yuri, he said, we are the only people in this room who can tell the truth. And he said, and you cannot tell my truth because he is African American. He said, you will be considered racist. And I cannot tell you truth because I will be considered a blind anti-communist. But you've been there, you saw this, and that's why they would hate you. And that was a prophecy. He was absolutely right. And even so-called leading Sovietologists, so it not like Steve Cohen, for example, he would even trash me on in his lectures and in his public appearances, which I consider to be as good, if not better, as a Nobel Prize, which right now is being given left and right, mostly left.
Yeah, the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, is a standing joke for a few years.
Yes, of course.
Well, I think, Klaus, that's it for us. Do we have any final remarks? Anything we would like to say?
I have lots of more questions, but we'll save them for another appearance.
Yeah, let's do that again maybe in a couple of months or something.
hopefully.
We would be very happy to have you on here soon again.
Okay, great. It was very nice to chat with you, and I hope to hear from you again.
Very good.
Hopefully we'll talk again soon, and this has been episode 63 of the Radio Mises. Returning soon with more information.
Excellent.
Detta avsnitt är klippt och mixat av CF-ljud. För klippning, mixning eller ljudförbättring, ta kontakt med cfljud@gmail.com.